Hello dear chess friends, I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy, and this time our lesson is dedicated to passed pawns. So to start with, we have to understand what is it to be a passed pawn. So actually we have to define the passed pawn or a passer, another common name for this special pawn. So a passed pawn is the one which has no opponent's pawns on its way, neither on the same file nor on adjacent files. So in this given position, we can notice only two passed pawns. They are b5 pawn because it has no pawns on the b file, and it has no opponent's pawn on the adjacent files, a file and c file. And the same is true for d7 pawn. So no opponent's pawns on the d file and no opponent's pawns on adjacent files. They are c file and e file. As for other pawns, they are not passed pawns by definition, because let's say f4 and f5 pawns have opponent's pawns on the same file. As for h4 pawn, it has the opponent's pawn on the adjacent file. It is the g6 pawn. The same is true for g6 itself. So it has opponent's pawn on adjacent file. It is the h file, and one more on the f file. It is a f4 pawn. So in this given position, we have only two passed pawns. They are b5 pawn and d7 pawn. So what is so special about passed pawns? We know that the pawn that reaches the back rank promotes to another piece, usually to a queen, which means that the side which manages to promote the own pawn usually achieves the decisive material advantage. That is why it is so important to promote a pawn, and the passed pawn is much better than any other sort of pawn in this sense, because it has much more chances to be promoted. For example, in this given position, we can notice that white has two pawns. The one is h4, which is not a passed pawn, and another one is d4, which is a passed pawn. And while white's h4 pawn simply can't move because it is blockaded by opponent's h5 pawn, d4 pawn has no limits on its way, so no opponent's pawns on the same file, no opponent's pawns on adjacent files, so nothing actually stops this pawn from moving further, except for probably opponent's king, but white's king is also here just to help this pawn to be promoted. So white's task is quite simple, just to ensure the promotion of the pawn. So king goes to e6, then to d6, just to get to c7, after which we can see that this king simply controls all squares on the way of this pawn, so that opponent's king can't stop this pawn. So king a8, d6, then d7, and d8 promotes to a queen, and white easily wins with the extra queen. It is clear that advanced passed pawns might become real threat, real danger for the opponent. Sometimes, however, the pair of advanced passed pawns may become better than opponent's rook. The pair of connected passed pawns reaching the 6th rank simply beats the rook. Doesn't really matter if the king can help those pawns to be promoted or not. The only condition is that opponent's king is also far away from the area where these pawns are placed. For example, a6, and appears that black is simply helpless, because one of the pawns definitely becomes a queen. For instance, if rook goes to the back rank just to try to stop those pawns, then b7 or a7 doesn't really matter, and well, another pawn goes there. So the win is just like automatic thing, because if rook goes away, then one of the pawns goes here and another one replaces it, wins. If, let's say, rook takes on b7 here, then a8 queen, and also the winning material advantage. If after a6, let's say, black tries to give a check and to try to stop pawns the other way, let's say occupying the 6th rank, it also doesn't help, because one of the pawn goes, already creating a threat of the promotion. So black simply has no time to take, for instance, b6 pawn. White simply promotes then the a7 one. And if finally rook goes to the back rank, then b7, we already saw how it works. So one of the pawns moves to the back rank next move, and another one just supports it and helps to replace one queen with another one. The next important question to discuss is how to neutralize the passed pawn. So we already understood how important the passed pawn is, how dangerous it is. So how to neutralize it? Well, the best way and the best possible defense is, of course, to capture the passed pawn. So just to grab this pawn, to get rid of it. But sometimes it is not possible. So in other cases, the most solid defense is actually to blockade the pawn, which means just to put the piece in front of this pawn. Like in this position, we can see that white's passer is already on a7, which means one move, one step before promotion. And the only way to stop this pawn is just to put the rook on a8, blockading this pawn. So now, as we can see, white can't really make a progress with the pawn. So pawn can't move further, it is blockaded. Well, this sort of defense is quite solid, as I said before, very efficient in the sense of stopping the pawn, but you have to understand that it also makes the piece which stops the pawn quite passive, because now the rook on a8 can't really move as well. So once the rook moves away somewhere, white simply promotes the pawn. So you have to consider it, you have to understand that when you choose this way of defense. Let's have a look on other possibilities. In this position, white again has the passed pawn on the a file, but in this situation it is not that advanced, so it is still on a2 square. And the best idea for black is actually to blockade this pawn exactly in this position, so to put the rook on a3. Why it is so important? Well, in this case, this pawn, even if rook moves away somewhere at some point, won't be that dangerous if compared to the position on the 7th rank one step before promotion. So let's have a look. For example, king gets closer, black's king also gets closer, and when the rook is attacked, as we can see, the rook can move because, well, in this case, of course, rook no longer blockades the pawn, but at the same time, the move with this pawn won't be fatal for black. So rook goes away, for example, pawn moves, but it's not a promotion. It is only one step towards the promotion, and black rook still can stop the pawn if it is needed. For example, it's possible to do with this maneuver rook to h6 and then to a6, stopping the pawn. And another thing that black can, for example, to try some active operations with this rook here. So rook h2, king a3, rook h3 is the best way to deal, because looks like white simply has no chance to improve his position, because once the king goes, let's say, to the first rank, it is possible to simplify a position this way. So rook takes rook, king takes rook, and now king goes to b4, attacking the pawn and performing the best way of fighting with the passed pawn, just grabs it next move. So as we can see, it is important to blockade the pawn as soon as possible, because in this case, you ensure that, well, even if this pawn will move in the future, it won't be fatal. And you also make your defendant piece not that passive. So in fact, this piece can move, and even if opponent's pawn moves, well, it won't be an immediate catastrophe. Another interesting situation and very important one to remember. So in this case, we can notice that white has a passer, again, on the 7th rank, only one step, only one move before promotion, and it is not blockaded here. So it doesn't look very solid for black, but at the same time it is quite good position for the rook on a1. So it is not in front of the pawn, but it is behind the pawn. And well, the difference between position on a8 and a1 is that black's rook here is quite active, so it can move still along the a file. Of course, the possibilities of this rook are limited. It's obvious, because it has to stay on the a file, controlling the a8 square, the square of promotion of this pawn. But still, this rook has moves if compared to the situation on a8 square, where it is absolutely limited. So in this situation, well, the best plan for black is just to get closer with the on king, to attack the rook, and then to attack the pawn twice. And we can see that white already has no chances to save the pawn. So next move, black will simply eliminate it. So it is very important to remember this method of placing the rook. It is very typical for rook endgames. So this principle is called just put the rook behind the pawn. Yeah, doesn't really matter whether it is your pawn or opponent's one. You will learn this principle later when you will learn rook endgames in details, but you already know that this method of defense against the promotion exists. Let's have a look on the other example. And now our task is to understand different methods of promoting the pawn. So we discussed the ways of stopping the pawn, just blockading or controlling the square of the promotion. Now we are acting for the strongest side, so we are going to promote our pawn. As we can see in this example, black has the bishop that controls the square of promotion of white's a7 pawn. It doesn't blockade the pawn, and in such a situation, it is a very common technique just to break the connection between this bishop and the square of promotion. So the square of promotion is a8, and how to do that, just to cover diagonal with the own bishop. So it might be not only the bishop, it might be the knight, it might be any other piece, maybe another pawn, but in this particular case it is the bishop. So bishop goes to c6, and now we can see that black's bishop no longer has the access to a8 square, which means that white is just in time to promote the pawn. For example, bishop c6, king c6, and nothing can stop this pawn from promotion. Let's have a look on other possibilities. In this position, we can see that white's passed pawn d7 is stopped by the bishop from a5. So it occupies this a5, d8 diagonal, which is partially controlled by the king already. So squares c7 and d8 are controlled by the king. And white can just control last two squares. They are b6 and a5 with the own knight. So knight goes to c4 here, attacking the bishop, controlling at the same time b6 square. As I said before, c7 and d8 squares are controlled by the king. And this actually forces black to go away from this diagonal. And once the bishop goes away from this diagonal, it no longer controls the square of the promotion, so I can easily promote the pawn. By the way, in the beginning, white could have used the technique from the previous example. It is to break the connection between the bishop and the square of promotion, and to do that, it was possible to play knight to d5, and at the next move, the knight simply gets to c7 square, breaking the connection between the bishop, a5 and d8 square, so that d8 queen becomes possible. And finally, let's have a look on the other example, which will be the last one in this lesson. We can see again that black uses the technique of just controlling the square of the promotion with the rook from behind. And we discussed that it is in many cases a very good way of defending, but here we can notice that black's king is placed not that good. So in the previous example of the same kind, the king was on g6. Here it is on g1, on the same rank with the own rook, and this gives white a chance to try another interesting way of promoting the pawn. So just to deflect the defending piece. So rook goes to b1 check. Well, if black doesn't want to lose this rook, for nothing he has to take the rook, which means that rook goes away from the a file, a8 square is no longer controlled, so white simply promotes the pawn and achieves the decisive material advantage. So this is the last example of this lesson. We discussed very important topic. We understood what is it to be a passed pawn, so what is the definition of the passed pawn. We understood why it is so important to understand which pawn is passed pawn, which pawn is not a passed pawn, because a passed pawn is extremely dangerous piece. Well, when it reaches the back rank, then it ensures the decisive material advantage for the side that promotes the pawn. And if compared to non-passed pawns, the passed pawn, of course, has much more chances to be promoted because it simply has no limits on its way in many cases. And we also discussed basic techniques of stopping the passed pawn and ensuring the promotion of the passed pawn. Thanks a lot for your attention. See you in next lessons.